towns and people who live close to the border. Mr. Speaker, there's an awful lot in this bill to talk about the Financial Measures Act, but I think that I've raised some of the concerns that I have and my caucus has, and I know that there'll be an opportunity for further discussion. So with that, I'm going to take my place, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton North.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise and speak to second reading of the Financial Measures Act today, Bill number 24. Mr. Speaker, I must say that a couple of items...
Order, please. The chatter's getting a little high. The member for Cape Breton North has the floor.
Yes, before starting, I do know that the honourable members, because I would pay attention to this, and people might accuse me of coming to that line close to it, with regards to unparliamentary language, but I do know the member from Halifax Citadel, I'm not making a point of order, but the use of the word hoodwinked might be suspect, but the word cheated, I do know from Beauchesne, is unparliamentary, and just if during the course of discussion, we need to be mindful of that on both sides of the House, and I know, as I say, I might be a person that goes to that line, but I do know if you cross it, as is the case, you've got to be mindful of it. And I just note that because the word was directly used. Well, Beauchesne says it's unparliamentary to the honourable member. But anyhow, that being said, I would like to speak directly to the bill itself. And as was discussed as well about where we are with some of the measures that are being utilized by the government and brought forward by the minister, and the concerns we would have about the basic needs. And I know the honourable member for Inverness had talked about we differ as a party and a caucus about some of the measures that have been implored by the government and being implemented, in this case through the Financial Measures Act, by the minister. And I do know that we would look to other alternatives, because I recall, and specifically if we look at HST, the 2%, which really was a loophole that was presented by virtue of the provinces of British Columbia and Ontario utilizing and asking the Government of Canada to provide for an HST provision, and that the province of Nova Scotia took advantage of that. What really was a 2-point reduction given by the Government of Canada, and it wasn't a provincial reduction we had in the past, this was a federal reduction that the Government of Canada had given to the taxpayers of our region. And the New Democratic Party, as a government, has decided to backfill through that loophole to get the money. And I recall when the budget was being formulated for the spring, the budget that was presented in May 2009, that a cabinet at the time, I do know that one of the models being looked at was HST. And should that be something we look at utilizing? Because when you put that 2% factor in, admittedly, it does look enticing when you're trying to find revenue at a difficult time. But, Mr. Speaker, when you realize to acquire what would have been well in excess of over $200 million and many uses for that, we also, as a government of the day and on principle, said we just should not be trying to even trigger taking away a benefit that was given by another order of government, the federal government, to Nova Scotians. And we chose not to do that, and we instead made choices to present a balanced budget, and a balanced budget that was presented and with great noise and fanfare by the now government, then opposition, about all the flaws that they saw in it. And ironically, to come to power and basically breaking every promise they made associated with the fiscal realities and presentation of the management of the province of Nova Scotia, saying they would have balanced budgets, that they wouldn't increase taxes, they wouldn't do prepays, all those things that they had concerns about, they, when they became government, chose to implement without, I guess, any of the sort of scrutiny that they would have sought as an opposition party. However, they've done that. Here we are. We've got a 2% HST increase that's going to happen. And it's going to happen and affect Nova Scotians. And some of the softer elements that none of us will dispute with regards to taking some relief, whether that's children's clothing and footwear, whether that's with feminine hygiene products or diapers. People won't dispute that, but the reality is, for a lot of working families, the overall impact is real, is going to have an effect, and people have stepped back because they're not aware of what the full impact of tax increases. It's one thing to try and put an array of benefits here and there, but people know tax, and they understand a tax because it's immediate and they see it. And what they know is this government has chosen taxation as a means of trying to fill in for the expenditures they've taken on because they've grown spending in the province. Yet one of the things the Minister of Finance on his Back to Balance road tour, or I call the dog and pony show around the province, was asking and challenging people how they would grow revenues. All I've seen for the most part to date is a government that has grown expenditure and no offsets of appropriate revenues to balance that and to provide real balance. Mr. Speaker, I don't discount any of the efforts with regards to renewable energy and a strategy for the province, but right now these renewable energy initiatives are going to have a cost impact on Nova Scotia without seeing significant revenue generating sources in other areas. I look at Daewoo with regards to, or Daewoo, some people would say, with the Trenton plant. That's important. $60 million investment, but it's also not immediately returned to the province because it is a longer-term investment. We hope in the longer term opportunities will be realized, but in the short term, it is an expense. And then you offset that with communities such as Yarmouth and southwest Nova Scotia with regards to the cancellation of the Cat Ferry. And while the government would claim that the business case was not there and still say they need to grow revenues, to take out what the impact of the subsidy for the ferry was, when you saw an economic impact of $175 million, 500 jobs affected by that, when you look at it for the sake of what remained at the end of the day, a $3 million, $3.5 million at most divide, for the government now to have to face that the government, the NDP, the Dexter NDP government, now own the highest unemployment rate in southwest Nova that they've known of 17%. And it's, as my honourable colleague from Halifax Clayton Park said, the highest unemployment rate ever that people are aware of. That is not a number or growth that the government should be talking about, because that does not grow jobs or opportunities. And the question really is, for the sake of $3 or $3.5 million and $175 million benefit, when you look at the income sources to government from HST, from taxes that are paid, from personal and corporate income taxes that were derived from Southwest Nova as contributors, which would be much more than what the government took away from the people. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that no one has disputed the fact in the long term that the Cat ferry wasn't the suitable one and that a monohull vessel is more appropriate. But I can think when we talk about Halifax, we know that the Metro Centre costs money for government to invest in. It doesn't bring immediate returns. It's always cost governments. The Halifax regional municipalities invested, the province has invested heavily, federal governments have supported initiatives, and I can only imagine if they just did a balance sheet analysis of saying, well, that bricks and mortar is not worth it, cut it out. Well, we all know that the economic impact in the HRM and in fact across Nova Scotia is significant, because it's the type of infrastructure that supports other economic activity and is an economic generator. Just as much as the Cat was a piece of infrastructure that supported a transportation link, that supported jobs, and we don't dispute that the numbers are not what we would want. We don't dispute that the long-term solution had to be different. We recognize that the federal government, before they could even finish the analysis of which $1 million was being invested, the province made a decision. More importantly, they've taken money out of the equation, Mr. Speaker, that rather than put it in. So it's ironic to have the Minister of Finance try to put forward a Financial Measures Act which taxes Nova Scotians more and not have done things to offset it, in fact, could have benefited Nova Scotians more as a result. I also know that the Minister of Finance, on regular occasion, as well as the Premier and others that would try to position the government, that they've said, Mr. Speaker, the fiscal books, it wasn't the numbers we had anticipated. It was much worse. You know, the sky had fallen after the June 9th election. Well, Mr. Speaker, what we found out after they spent a lot of taxpayers' money on outside consultants, on the audit that the Premier promised, and then the audit, the non-audit after he became in government of what it became, but that their own auditors from Deloitte sat in this chamber during public accounts and did confirm that the books, and was asked, were the books cooked? No, they weren't. Did they follow generally accepted accounting principles? Yes, they did. Did we in the province of Nova Scotia enter an election in deficit? No, we weren't. And Deloitte in this chamber for public accounts indicated that when they took over in July, after the election, that the government was part of precipitating, that they said the deficit when they took over the books was $53 million after an election that was triggered during the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. That's what the NDP have as part of their legacy. Those are the numbers, and those numbers speak for themselves. So out of that, Mr. Speaker, they went and gave the terms of reference to Deloitte. And unlike anything I've seen, they've said you were to take the numbers from the May 2009 budget, make no other assumption or adjustments, make no other considerations, and show us what the numbers would be in out years from there. So they put the blinders on a process and not allowed for any other considerations, any other measures that would have been there from a consultancy basis. So what Deloitte had from the government was you can do a study, but you can only do the study based upon the numbers, based upon assumptions, which weren't even the current government's numbers and didn't take into account the changes that resulted because of the NDP putting an election as their priority rather than stability at a time when Nova Scotians need it most. So what we do have is this little chart as part of the dog and pony show for this back to balance, and that has in the graphs to show people, and they've used that to say it's a fact. What was interesting, Mr. Speaker, I never noticed the validation from within the civil service to those numbers. There were outside numbers that they took as whole to try and justify a public relations spin doctoring effort to try and put themselves, because what we knew, because where they were going, Mr. Speaker, was to create a massive deficit in their first year, to take spending at a time when revenues were down and spend needlessly and try to blame the previous government based upon consulting out to get these numbers. And their own economic advisory panel of experts told them not to do certain things, that they spent money on that as well. And, Mr. Speaker, what they do? Ignore some of that advice as well. They ignored it. These experts, so it's been a very selective process. However, what I do know is between the first NDP budget and now this second NDP budget, as well as other borrowing that they've taken on, Nova Scotians have now seen over $1 billion of extra debt in 10 short months. And those are on the long-term books of Nova Scotia. And the minister and the government can say what they want, but they created those numbers. They made choices at a time when what were political priorities weren't people priorities, and they weren't the priorities of average Nova Scotians. There wasn't a genuine agenda from the government. There wasn't the interest of working families at the core of what the government was doing. There was a spin doctoring exercise that we have not seen of historic proportion here in the province of Nova Scotia. That is the reality. That is what history will show. And in fact, their own auditors, their own consultants have shown that those are choices they made, not a previous government, not previous sessions of the House, choices they've made. And Mr. Speaker, even on energy alone, with renewables, and again, I'm supportive because we initiated that path forward for renewables. But what we don't have is a government that looks to growing the revenues that are necessary. When we saw in New Brunswick with the NB Power and Quebec Hydro. Everyone thought it was going to become Q Brunswick next door with the deal that they put forward that would be devastating. And what happened in Nova Scotia? We sat by. Meanwhile, Premier Williams is issuing some concerns. I hope the Speaker can get untangled there. Premier Williams had brought forward his concern. Nova Scotians were quiet on that. We didn't hear, and we were saying, where are we with the Atlantic Energy Corridor and the Atlantic Energy Gateway initiatives that are long-term and can create economic opportunity, much infrastructure with our transmission, with collaborating with Newfoundland and Labrador on the Lower Churchill, having a landfall on Cape Breton to see the opportunities that could be realized. Nothing was happening. What happened with the Dexter NDP cabinet and government was sit and wait, and maybe we'll wait and see what they do, and then we'll come up with our communications plan. And we see that oft times, Mr. Speaker, and that is a reality. So when there was opportunities to advance initiatives, nothing's been done. We've talked about our offshore oil and gas play, and the minister often bemoans the fact that revenues are down, royalties are down, but we do not hear the government trying to grow those opportunities. Now, I did ask the Minister of Energy in the House about what's happening, and he indicated there's confidential talks going on, and I will take that at word because I recognize that a lot of these companies, most of them are dealing with the stock market, but we haven't seen an aggressive effort by the government to get out there and to open up business opportunities for Nova Scotia. We have not seen a government trying to grow revenues in a very much a global competitive environment. And that is a shortcoming of this government, and it is a real cost to Nova Scotians. It's impacting Nova Scotians as we speak in this chamber today. And it is something that is going to impact Nova Scotians, as the member for Inverness had said before. Governments prior had made decisions which we still have an impact today. The government today has made decisions that will impact, indeed, future generations. And what we do know now, with the clarity of after the election dust had settled, that Nova Scotians will pay a premium and a real price as a result of an NDP government. So this Financial Measures Act is one more nail in the fiscal coffin, so to speak, of Nova Scotia. It may be what the minister and the government needs to get those revenues, but the manner in which they're going about getting those revenues, the reasons for those revenues, and the reason for the practices of the government to date, I don't think are going to go away. Because one of the things, Mr. Speaker, when I talked about the first NDP budget with a massive deficit, the money, almost $500 million right there, $500 million that they inflicted Nova Scotians with, and trying to do a prepay so that the second year of $222 million wouldn't look as bad, or that really in their second budget would try to make them look like the numbers were coming down. Just as much as they contrived the numbers going up with regards to deficit, they contrived a process to try and make the numbers go down. That the professionals have already analyzed, and it speaks for itself. So no discussion from the government is going to dilute or take away that reality. And Nova Scotians, when they get a full understanding of the impact of this Financial Measures Act, when they themselves are impacted by this act, and that there is not enough offsetting benefit, if they have truly not created the conditions for a recovering economy in a post-recessionary environment, if they have not dealt with making sure that all of the economic sectors in Nova Scotia are being fully and fairly treated, we will suffer further at the hands of this socialist government. And Mr. Speaker, I know that in dealing with the matters that come before this House, we're going to see program, initiative, and it's all going to be there. And as I always say, you know, the good chairman of the establishment across the way, he and his inner circle, which apparently is very tight, since some of the ministers don't even know what the chairman of the board is doing, But apparently if you're in a special interest group, you know before your cabinet colleagues do, as was indicated. And the Premier now has expanded, I believe, this panel. What's the name of the panel? The Economic Advisors panel has had new additions to it. Interesting additions as well, because it also speaks to additions that I think reflect the government and where they're trying to achieve their own balance. And at the same time, Nova Scotians will quickly find out as time moves on, I think a lack of consensus will come forward. I think that some of the special interests that are being advocated for, and we've seen the impact on working families already. So there's a real dichotomy of where this government had started when they were in opposition to where they've arrived in government. And as I said, and when I started out, we had some choices facing us as a previous government, and HSP being one of them, that we would not go down that road at a principle. Yet, for a grasp of trying to offset both their spending, the commitments, the favors, whatever you want to call it, Mr. Speaker, for all those that needed some reward at the expense of the next generations of Nova Scotians in a very expeditious way for the NDP. But in truth, Mr. Speaker, the long-term impact on this province is going to be one that this Financial Measures Act, while the minister has presented his rationale, is not what the people in the coffee shops of the province are saying. And you know, people, when we were in government prior, would say, well, we hear them in the coffee shops. Well, I've heard them in the coffee shops, and I know the honourable members can hear them in coffee shops. And the coffee shop talk about what this government is doing is much less complimentary than the speaking notes of the Premier and the Minister of Finance and the government members. They know, and many of those members know, that average Nova Scotians, working families, thought they were getting genuine leadership. And instead, they've got another bill of goods to deal with, and part of it is packaged up in the Financial Measures Act. Again, to try and hopefully get down the road that in a budget or two, and I do hope the economy has the recovery, because I hope for Nova Scotians we have that level of recovery, that indeed they will try and make it look and manipulate the graphs so that, look, oh heavens, look how far we've come. But when the process was flawed from the beginning, they need not think the outcome is going to give them the benefit. And I look at today, when people were talking about Southwest Nova Scotia, and members raised concerns again about the impact in Southwest Nova Scotia. Businesses are closing in Southwest Nova Scotia. They're not just downsizing, they're now closing. Unemployment rates is, say, 17%. So what's the Premier say? Well, you know, the good news is housing costs are up. Well, those are housing costs for luxury houses. And I don't think the 500 people, by and large, that were now turfed to the curb and put under the Dexter bus, that they, Mr. Speaker, were buying luxury homes, and the cost of those homes were something they could even access. That's a reality, because those are working families down there that could not benefit from that. We all know, as was indicated by the member from Kings West, that there's a lot of price being moved up from the foreign purchases of homes around this whole province. And it is a beautiful part of Nova Scotia. So those numbers go up. But the real number is 17% unemployment now. Wait until the full impact is heard. And I have not heard, other than setting up a committee on top of a committee by the government to try and have their own influence on a process and maybe to spin it a story a bit better than what it is. So how is it when that, for the sake of an additional $3.5 million, $175 million in direct economic benefit to an entire region, and as was indicated, and we've spoken in this House as Cape Bretoners before, when the Cape Breton resorts had 40% of their traffic was coming through the CAT, through the Yarmouth Ferry, as a portal in the province, Mr. Speaker. That's one of those realities. And so the government, with political haste, made a decision. But the people are impacted, and those very people that have been thrown to the curb, out of their jobs, as I've said, under the Dexter bus, they're also going to have higher taxes on top of it with money they no longer have coming in as income. That's the reality. That is a reality for those families and those people around the province. And what about the local entrepreneurs? The Minister of Finance can talk about, trying to benefit small business tax rates. When a company has to shut its doors, there are no taxes because there's no revenues and there's nothing to expend. This government has put the locks on business opportunities and small business opportunities in this province. That's a reality. You don't have to question it because the companies are closing up in Southwest Nova right now. The other concern is, as a result of that ill-headed and the nonsense that we've heard and seen from this government, how many more companies are going to be impacted around the province? How many summer students are not going to get hired because companies can't afford to bring on some extra staff? How many people are not going to be hired on for seasonal employment because the volume of traffic is not going to be there because the tourism season has been disrupted this year? How many companies in and around the HRM that have benefited from our offshore are going to stall and feel a stalemate in their economic opportunities when they know that further offshore activity has not been initiated because the government has not been proactive getting it done? How is it, Mr. Speaker, people have clarity about the long-term future, as was raised from the member from Digby Annapolis, and I've advocated, and I have been a pro-development, but I've also been pro having a panel to look at things and to put in a panel so that the economic or industry, as well as through traditional fisheries and communities and the environment, could be properly considered in a nonpartisan, public, independent way. The government refuses to do that. And what it tells us is the government, like we've seen with other measures, already has a plan but won't disclose it to Nova Scotians because the last time an independent, nonpartisan panel was set to do work, it did its work and a decision was made, and that was a moratorium. And people have said science has changed, industry has changed, knowledge has changed, economic conditions have changed, but there's no ability for all sides, those that are pro and against a moratorium, those that just want to know, what is the science? What's the community saying? So we don't have that clarity because obviously there has been a decision made because of the way the government won't answer questions as opposed to what they are. And that's unfortunate, but it also means that Nova Scotians live in an environment that's of uncertainty. And what I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, about a political region, a geographic region, in this case, the province of Nova Scotia, with this much uncertainty, who wants to invest? Who's going to take an interest when the government has sent mixed messages on every economic sector that I can think of in the province? How does that grow revenues? Because the Minister of Finance challenged people in those meetings before the hired staff took the mics out of people's hands, wouldn't let them speak. But he challenged people to say, well, where are you going to get the revenues? And we've heard from Nova Scotians about what is necessary for revenue generation. Yet again, whether it was a consultant ripping the mic out of someone's hand in one of these road shows, or the government just ripping opportunities away from people in the communities around this province, that is a reality. Because I have not heard a Chamber of Commerce come forward and say, kudos to the government. What they're trying to do is find some kernel of goodness, something positive to try and ingratiate themselves, maybe, hoping the government will take a better interest. And Mr. Speaker, when the voice of small business speaks up, you criticize that voice, as was with the CFIB. The Minister of Finance has done that. Has done it several times in this chamber alone, questioning the credibility of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And as I said to the Premier during estimates, on Hollis Street alone, 2 businesses I've been in, small businesses, mom and pop operations, one operator said before leaving and paying a bill, tell me, I just want to know, you're up the street there with all the other politicians, the CFIB, are they doing anything for us? And I said, yes, they are. And I said, they've stood up for you, and the Minister of Finance has attacked them as a result. He said, well, I'm glad to know that my membership fee is doing something for me. And there's a small business operator asking if the CFIB is doing it because they had faith they were, and were questioning it because of the types of actions the government was taking. The same organization the minister would attack, the mom and pop operations, even in a metropolitan area, are asking for that voice. The minister also referenced chambers of commerce, and well, I listened to them around the province. Well, I've heard from chambers of commerce, and they disagree with the Minister of Finance. They all want better outcomes because we're trying to get through an uncertain economic time. So the pall of uncertainty that's been cast over this entire province by knee-jerk reactions on one hand, by sheer political determination to implement an agenda at any cost, including driving the debt of the province of Nova Scotia up. They've been willing to do that, and then go out and try to suggest that everything is good and well. The real concern, and the Minister of Finance talks about temporary measures. I like that term. We got a temporary measure we're going to put in place until things get balanced again. Well, the temporary measures hopefully will be just that, because we'll have a temporary government and only one chance at this to inflict what they have on working families throughout this province. That's a reality. So in the Financial Measures Act, of which there's many technical and financial mechanisms the minister will use and provisions set forth, we have to look at where we'll be after this, because we all know that after this debate, the numbers are there across the way. You know, the numbers are there to make sure this act and any agenda items get forced through. And we also know that they will be held as they leave this chamber. We're already in the process of what the third NDP Dexter budget is going to look like. And I'll be really intrigued, Mr. Speaker, where we end up, given the fact that we have not made progress since the last government fell in May of 2009. We have not made progress from the first NDP budget. We are not making progress. We're just pushing numbers through because there's a majority to push them through. But we're not putting people first. It's about NDP priorities. But we've also seen, depending on who you are, depending what title you hold, you may just be in better favor than actually working families around this province that thought they were getting genuine leadership. So, Mr. Speaker, as this debate goes forward, and it will, we know that, we'll be listening to what average Nova Scotians, we even hear from, higher income Nova Scotians that actually put a lot of their own money back in to the economy to grow other jobs and opportunity. And I'll be watching to see if they're holding back on investments. And I'm also concerned, Mr. Speaker, for average Nova Scotians, because the other thing we're seeing is something that is affecting nationally, and that is the bank rates. If Nova Scotians that have, as we know, debt, whether that's their own mortgages, their lines of credit, their credit cards, that if bank rates start to go up and it impacts people, you'll see them hold off on spending. So some of the very projections that people are talking about can be thrown totally off the table if other conditions change. And that's part of the wider uncertainty that is out there. And as a result of that, I've also seen other jurisdictions in this country take a more proactive approach to how to deal with the fiscal situation. And again, we are dealing with an act that's going to deal with expenditures and take more money in and take more money away, but we have not heard where the revenues are coming in and where the government's plan is to offset all those expenditures with positive revenue growth for Nova Scotians. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will leave my comments there for now, and I know I'll be back another day to comment further. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you and the members of the House and look forward to the Minister's further comments on the bill.
If I am to recognize the Minister, it would be to close debate on second reading of Bill 24, the Financial Measures Act. If I'm to recognize the minister, it'll be to close debate on the bill, Bill 24, the Financial Measures Act. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank all members who contributed to the debate tonight. Every suggestion, every comment will be considered as we move forward. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move second reading of the Financial Measures 2010 Act.
Thank you. The motion before the House is for second reading of Bill 24. Is the House ready for the question? Would all those in favour of the motion before the House say aye? Aye. Those against? Nay. The motion is carried.
Bill 24, entitled An Act Respecting Certain Financial Measures.
Order that that bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the Acting Deputy Government House Leader, the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's certainly an honour again to rise as the Acting Deputy Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, I now ask you to call Bill number 19, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill number 19, the Motor Vehicle Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to the comments of the members of the House and the process that we're unfolding, of course, with our historic legislature and law amendments. And I'd like to make a few introductory comments on Bill number 19. Mr. Speaker, as you are well aware, the safety and integrity of our highways are a key priority for the Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. And of course, it is an important issue for all Nova Scotians. This includes working closely with the trucking industry as partners in keeping travel on our highways safe and efficient. And during one of the many commitments that I've had the pleasure of dealing with since becoming the Minister of Transportation, I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, it's with great pleasure that you have the opportunity to meet with representatives of the trucking industry, as they are fully aware, of course, of the conditions of our highways, and they are, of course, concerned about the safety because that is their place of work. The department receives many routine applications to change weight limits on particular roads for certain vehicles. And these, of course, come from members of the trucking industry. They are the experts. They are the experts in the cabs. They are the experts for looking at these particular situations. And these routine applications end up on my desk. Once studied by department staff and approved by the minister, these applications require cabinet approval and amendments to the road listings and the weights and dimensions of vehicles regulations. And I know that members often pay close attention to it because in many parts of our province, this is important as we look at the weights of highway restrictions, as commerce, of course, never stops in this province. Particularly, however, we have difficulties at certain times of the year when we're looking at getting access to certain highways and certain roads. The proposed amendment that I'm introducing to the Motor Vehicle Act will give the minister the authority to make and approve ministerial regulations regarding the listing of these roads and for future amendments to those listings. Allowing the updating of road lists in this manner will reduce the necessity for cabinet to deal with routine matters and allow changes to be implemented in a more efficient manner. From my experience, based upon the advice that I received from staff, and then taking this forward to my colleagues in cabinet, I know you might find this hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, but on most occasions, the members of the cabinet actually do listen to me on certain occasions. It must be my expertise or the great staff. I'll put it on the great staff. Allowing the updating of the road listed in this manner will reduce the necessity for cabinet to deal with these routine matters. That's important to know. And this is, after all, the gist of the amendment which I'm introducing. Department staff, however, will continue to assess all requests for road reclassification, and they'll make the recommendations to myself as minister or ministers of the future. It is the staff, after all, that are the experts, and I will be taking their advice. Mr. Speaker, we will continue our discussions with representatives of the trucking industry, and where appropriate, we'll respond to their requests in a timely manner, and that is the key issue, in a timely manner. They are important partners, the men and women in the trucking industry, And as the MLA for Timberley Prospect and as the Minister of Transportation, I'm pleased to always have their input. On many occasions, as I've said to so many of them, I'm just a phone call away. So with those few comments, hopefully members opposite will support these amendments as we expedite this important issue and work closely with the representatives of the trucking industry. Thank you for your time, Mr. Speaker.
I will now recognize the honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and say a few words on Bill number 19. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a housekeeping amendment to the Motor Vehicle Act related to road classifications and the trucking industry. Mr. Speaker, this bill amends the Motor Vehicle Act to give the Minister of Transportation the power to make regulations prescribing highways or portions of highways that are included in classes of highways prescribed in other regulations. The proposed amendments will lessen the complexity and confusion of changes to highway weight and dimension regulations. According to government, this will make the reclassification process more efficient and therefore more economical for the industry. Essentially, Mr. Speaker, it allows the minister to expedite the process of reclassifying roads by his office signing off on a change rather than having it to go through the entire cabinet process, Mr. Speaker. So the reason behind this is that when a reclassification of a road is granted, it can sit on the docket for a considerable amount of time before it goes through cabinet approval. But the road is still in operation under the new classification. So because of this, the newly classified road is actually operating illegally. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few comments, our caucus is pleased to support this bill through second reading and allow this bill to move to law amendments to allow the general public the opportunity to come forward and comment on this piece of legislation. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I want to congratulate the minister for bringing forward this bill. In my time in transportation, one of the things that was quite obvious to me was the trucking industry a lot of time is controlled or influenced by many things that are outside its control. The weather, obviously frost levels in the spring, the changing of designation for highways and roads. One thing, Mr. Speaker, I'm really proud of we were able to do was in regards to the updating of closure of highways in regards to dialing 511. And I know the minister would be well aware of that because it was actually the Deputy Minister of Transportation that I think brought in one of the first 511 processes in this country. And I can tell you, ministers across the country are very interested. So I'm really pleased the minister's brought this forward. It only makes sense that the minister would have the authority, as a result of recommendations by his staff, to actually to move on whether it's closing highways, opening highways, or whatever. And it's very important to the trucking industry. A lot of times they can't wait for days. We gave them the ability through the 511 to find out by midnight, for example, of a certain night that a road may be opening or closing the next day. That's very beneficial to the trucking industry. And again, for the minister to bring this forward today, it only makes sense that the minister, with the expertise of his staff, would make recommendations to him in that regard would be suffice, and would, in fact, would allow for those transactions to happen in regards to the closing or again opening of highways. So this is a very appropriate amendment this time. Congratulate the minister on that, and our caucus will certainly support the change to be made today by the Minister of Transportation in regards to Bill number 19.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable minister to move second reading of Bill 19. The honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the members opposite. Those comments are much appreciated, particularly my predecessor at one time in that department, and based upon your reputation and how things were done at that time, that's an endorsement that I will thank you for publicly again. With those few comments, I move that this bill now proceed through to the historic law amendments, and we continue the process of making Bill 19 law in this province.
The motion before the House is for second reading of Bill 19. Is the House ready for the question? Would all those in favour of the floor on the motion on the floor say aye? Aye. Those against? Motion is carried.
Bill 19, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the Acting Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like you to call Bill number 36, Engineering Protection. He's not here. Bill number 41, the Volunteer Fire Service Act.
I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the House today for the second reading of Bill 41, which will amend the Volunteer Fire Services Act. Mr. Speaker, this act not only helps recognize the efforts of our brave volunteers, but also extends to them protection and security as they perform their volunteer duties. And while this act currently focuses on the efforts of our volunteer firefighters in the province, there is another group of Nova Scotians who have consistently answered the call when their communities needed them, our many ground search and rescue teams. Mr. Speaker, over the past 40 years, the ground search and rescue teams of Nova Scotia have provided countless volunteer hours. These individuals spring into action, often searching for people they have never met, regardless of the situation. Through rain and snow, through harsh conditions any time of the year, these Nova Scotians are out there answering the call. Mr. Speaker, it should also be noted that ground search and rescue teams played an important role in civil emergency response during major emergencies. This included events such as Swiss Air disaster, Hurricane Juan, the 2005 floods in Lunenburg and Queens counties, and more recently, the fires in both Porters Lake and Herring Cove. They assisted in evacuation, traffic control, transport, and resource provisions. Mr. Speaker, these men and women donate their time, efforts, and resources, often at great risk to their own safety when an emergency strikes. That's why I am very pleased to rise today, Mr. Speaker, to speak about these amendments. And as I stated earlier, the Act already supports our brave volunteer firefighters as they help protect our communities. Now these protections will be extended to this outstanding group of Nova Scotians. Among other things, this includes a payment of $100,000 in the unfortunate event of an accidental death during the performance of their duties. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, so far there has not been a situation in Nova Scotia involving a ground search and rescue volunteer where such a benefit would have had to be paid. However, going forward, it is important that the protections be in place as these volunteers continue to head out to perform their duties, often into dangerous situations. Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House can agree that ground search and rescue teams play a valuable role in keeping our province safe. I think I speak for most Nova Scotians when I say that the efforts of these volunteers is greatly appreciated. Through their actions, they provide comfort and support at a time when people need it the most. With over 1,000 members, these teams of brave Nova Scotians respond at all hours to help in the most distressing of times, and we recognize and thank them for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased today to rise in my place and to give full support to this piece of legislation. It's one of those pieces of legislation that comes in after a good act is in place, but needs a little more embracive title and clause that actually has practical implications for ground search and rescue. In my area of the province, and I'm sure these comments would be echoed by the members from Kings South and Kings North. The Annapolis Valley Ground Search and Rescue has an outstanding reputation in our area. We have had several tragedies around the Cornwallis and Annapolis rivers, and ground search and rescue in the heart of winter have given untold hours and days to work, unfortunately, in some of those cases, for the recovery of a tragic victim. And we know, however, there are very many heartening stories of rescues, and especially, finding lost hunters, children that have wandered from a campground into wooded areas. We also have those kinds of, very, very good results from ground search and rescue. Again, they're another of our volunteer group, members of our volunteer group who have tremendous training. They come to ground search and rescue with first aid, with CPR, with a whole range of skills to help them advance their work. And as the minister pointed out, we hope they don't have to draw upon an insurance policy that is in place should they be caught in a very unfortunate and tragic situation. I know in our area, and probably it's like this across the province, they put all kinds of man hours in to restore, for example, old school buses that will help move a large number of volunteers into the site where the search is going to take place. They have to do a lot of their own fundraising. I know in our area they're hoping to be able to get an Argo so that they can go into rivers and swamps and areas to take part in searches. So what the minister has brought forward here is an absolutely important recognition and inclusiveness in the highly regarded group of volunteers along with the fire departments in our province. So our party will give full support to this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to rise in my place this afternoon to speak on Bill number 41, an act to amend Chapter 13 of the Acts 2002 of the Volunteer Fire Services Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill amends the Volunteer Fire Service Act to include recognition of and protection for volunteer ground search and rescue workers and volunteer ground search and rescue organizations. Mr. Speaker, members of the ground search and rescue, like volunteer firefighters, put their lives on the line each and every time they answer a call. They leave not knowing what is facing them, and like the firefighters, they do it on a volunteer basis. Mr. Speaker, we need look no further than our own Cape Breton Ground Search and Rescue team to see the tremendous work that these organizations do. So, Mr. Speaker, our caucus supports the legislation and sees it as another way to protect the families of ground search and rescue workers, and we look forward to it proceeding to law amendments. With that, Mr. Speaker, thank you.
Thank you. The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes as well. I want to commend the minister for bringing this bill forward. It's great to have this amendment. I'm very fortunate in Hants West and our area to have a great team there. And it should be noted these folks work with very little. They are not only volunteer, but they work with very little in some cases. I know in my area they're working with what they had an old bus for traveling around in, and now a used van from one of the local fire departments, which is great, but at the same time, they're still working with great difficulties, and it's good to be able to support them. I know that our government in the past has supported them through generator program and some assistance in my local area, at least anyway, but very worthy of mentioning these folks and the fact that this bill is very worthy, and the support of this bill for these folks goes right where it should go in support of these good, fine folks that are out there every day volunteering when no hesitation when you call upon them, and we're pleased to have this. I'm pleased to have this brought forward and support this wholeheartedly, and thanks very much.
If I'm to recognize the minister, it will be to close debate on Bill 41, Volunteer Fire Service Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm now pleased to ask the support of the House in moving this to law amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion before the House is for second reading of Bill 41. Is the House ready for the question? Will all those in favor of the motion on the floor say aye? Aye. Those against? Motion is carried.
Bill 41, title and act amend Chapter 13 of the Acts of 2002, the Volunteer Fire Services Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the government host leader.
Why, thank you. It's so seldom I'm in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, would you please call bills for second reading? Bill number 23, Sea Army Air and Navy League Cadets Day Act.
Thank you. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Sea, Army, Air and Navy League cadets continue to make a valuable contribution to communities throughout the province. The cadet organizations instill in our young people the principles of teamwork, citizenship, respect for others, and true leadership. Cadets also learn other valuable life skills such as public speaking, self-confidence, physical fitness, and first aid. They can also participate in music, sports, and enjoy a variety of summer camps. And Mr. Speaker, I just would say that I know this from firsthand experience, and I growing up in a very small rural community like I did in Milton, and being a member of the Air Cadet Squadron, 545 Squadron. This was certainly an extraordinary opportunity for me, and we traveled around the province. I got to meet lots of other young people involved in Air Cadets as well. When I sometimes find it difficult to realize how far in the rearview mirror those days actually are, but they are nonetheless a great part of one's experience. The cadets have a proud history in this province, Mr. Speaker. One of the oldest cadet corps in Canada can be found here in Nova Scotia. Ever since the first meeting of cadets in Windsor in 1881, thousands of Nova Scotians have been graduates of the program. These graduates have become active, responsible members of their communities. Some have become leaders in their chosen fields, such as business, science, arts, and politics. But all of them carry with them, as I do, the lessons they learned while they were in cadets for the rest of their lives. And that's why I'm so proud to have introduced the Sea, Army, Air, Navy League Cadets Day Act and speak on its behalf today. The special day designated under this bill would commemorate all the work the cadet programs do throughout the year in building strong and healthy youth in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, it takes many people to establish and run a squadron or corps. The 4 cadet organizations in the Canadian Forces are obvious ones to note. But there are also community leaders, parents, service clubs, businesses, and volunteers who support their local cadets in many, many ways. All are richly rewarded by a group of young people who walk tall and proud into adulthood, carrying with them the life lessons learned in cadets to help guide them. Our province is better because of it. Mr. Speaker, with those comments, I would like to move second reading of Bill number 23.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise and speak for a few moments on this bill that the Premier has introduced, and I would like to congratulate the Premier on introducing this bill to the House. It's probably long overdue and should have been done long ago, but nevertheless, it's a recognition of the programs that are out there for young people today and have been for a long time. I just wonder how the Premier got in the Navy after being an air cadet. But anyway, he eventually took the right road and went into the sea element. And there's a saying that I've had for many years is "Go Navy," you know, and I know the Premier has a special meaning for that saying as well. My first association with the Sea Cadets, and I'll talk about all the cadets for a few moments, but Sea Cadets in particular, my first association was when I joined the Sea Cadets back in 1955, and at the tender age of 12. And you had to be 13 to get into cadets in those days, and you had to be 5'2". The reason you had to be 5'2" was that the Canadian Forces, or the Navy, Royal Canadian Navy at that time, only had uniforms that would fit people 5'2" and up. So that's why cadets had to be 5'2". So, and you had to be 13, but a little slip of the pen could fix that up when you were trying to get into the cadet corps. So I actually got in a little bit younger than 13. But one of my first remembrances of the cadet corps at the time, and all of the things that come after that, that make this a great movement, was we were invited up to the opening of the Cancel Causeway in 1955. And as such, as Sea Cadets, we were invited to go aboard. I'm not sure, my memory is failing me, but it was either HMCS Ontario or HMCS Quebec. We had 2 light cruisers in the Navy at the time. And one of them was, I think it was the Ontario. But anyway, that was a big thrill to be at the opening of the Cancel Causeway and to meet some sailors, RCN sailors who still wore the square rig, you know, in those days, prior to the integration of the Canadian Forces. But after that, the cadet program evolved for me and for other cadets at the time of going to summer camps, playing a role in the operation of those summer camps as you got older. And my first recollection of that, Mr. Speaker, was the camp at Royal Canadian Sea Cadet Training Establishment Protector, which was in Point Edward in Cape Breton, and used to house upwards of 3,000 or 4,000 Sea Cadets every summer in 3 different sections. Some were there for 2 weeks. Others, like myself, are lucky to get 6 or 7 weeks there because we lived close. And at that time, believe it or not, the Navy used to pay the cadets who were on staff there. And I had the fortunate experience of doing some training of sailors doing some sail training, I should say, in craft like maybe the Premier recognized them, but dinghies, whalers, and cutters. No longer in the employ of the cadet movement. They've got others, more exotic names for those sailing craft then. But we used to do that sailing in Sydney Harbor, and the city was alive, you know, at that time with cadets for a 2-month period in the summertime. Until a little later on, the Canadian Sea Cadet Training Establishment was commissioned as a ship in the Royal Canadian Navy called HMCS Acadia. And HMCS Acadia was the successor to the Sea Cadet Training Establishment. And then cadets were invited to attend these camps when they were all regular force RCN people, were then doing all the instructing and assisted by senior cadets like myself and hundreds of other people who were around then. And then somebody had the bright idea to move HMCS Acadia out of Cape Breton and down to Cornwallis and integrating it with the Navy at Cornwallis. And they said they were doing that at the time for practical purposes. Now, we were on Sydney Harbor with a beautiful harbor for sailing, so they moved the cadet training establishment down to Cornwallis, which had no harbor. So what we had to do when we got there, we looked and the tide was out so far, you'd have to, it would take you a day to get a dinghy out there before you could even sail it. So anyway, we had to go down to a place called French Basin, you know, which was down the road for our sailing when those classes took place, and we were down there, and we would take advantage of French Basin, which are very tricky sailing cutters in French Basin, because if you didn't watch it, you could be up on the highway if you were under full sail on a windy day. You know, those 32-foot cutters or 27-foot whalers were pretty awesome craft to try to control in a small basin like French Basin. But anyway, the cadet movement really took off at Cornwallis over the years, and in the Cadet Corps in Sydney, Mr. Speaker, as you know, many of the people who went through the Cadet Corps in Sydney, and Sydney Sea Cadet Corps at one time had over 200 cadets in it, and we had a band of 50 at that time, and during those heydays. And I can recall that during the days of HMCS Acadia, the Deputy Premier should be proud of this, because we had two bands, what we call the camp bands for the summer, and one was the 40-person New Waterford Sea Cadet Band. Were one of the best in the Maritimes at the time, if not Canada, and also the band from Summerside PEI. And they, so anyway, yeah, so the band, the Sea Cadet Band in New Waterford and the band from Summerside PEI were seconded for the summer. And the cadets were all paid in those days as the host bands, or the host bands for the summer camp, and were involved in such great ceremonies as the sunset ceremony, which I personally took an interest in, and was as a cadet petty officer and chief petty officer, was commander of the guard a couple of times, or petty officer of the guard, and later on as an officer of commanding the guard in the sunset ceremony. So that was a big thrill for me, but it was more of a big thrill for some of the other kids who were coming behind me at the time, because they were in awe of what senior cadets were able to do with the support of the Canadian government and the Navy, and I'm sure that's the same. Anything I do say here today references the Air Cadets, the Army Cadets as well, because they had their own way of doing it. I'm just biased, I guess, for the Sea Cadet movement. But when I graduated from Sea Cadets in at the age of 19, 1960, I think it was, something like that. I was offered a warrant, what they called in the Sea Cadets, as an officer, and I gladly accepted that and became an officer. And shortly after that, because of my background and because of the job I was doing in civilian life, and because of my education, I guess, I was offered a commission. Some people were offered a commission in the Royal Canadian Navy. So I guess one of the proudest days of my life of being a cadet was to be given a Royal Canadian Naval Commission, which was done on parchment. No, I don't know whether, Mr. Premier, yours were done split English and French by the time you got there, but mine was done by parchment, handwritten, and was signed by the Governor General and the Minister of National Defense. And it simply said, along with the other naval jargon, it simply awarded me a commission in Her Majesty's Royal Canadian Fleet as a sub-lieutenant. And that to me was just like winning the lottery, because my dream had come true to get a commission in the Royal Canadian Navy. And in those days it was the Royal Canadian Navy. It wasn't Canadian Forces, brackets C, you know. So anyway, that was prior to integration. And so I had the opportunity to travel as a reserve naval officer attached to Scotia at the time here, and doing my work with the cadets in Sydney. And in the late 60s, taking cadets from the Sydney Corps and from the other corps as an escort officer. We used to go down to, I used to be employed in the leadership school at Cornwallis. And as such, I'd be there for the summer. Had no problem getting leave of absence from my job, because they realized that the valuable work that cadets were doing and cadet officers were doing and naval reserve officers were doing. So anyway, one summer in 1969, I had the opportunity to take 25 Sea Cadets to the United States to join up with the United States Navy. The carrier, aircraft carrier, the USS Lexington, was based in Pensacola, Florida. And we went aboard the USS Lexington to observe air operations, naval air operations on the Lexington in the Gulf of Mexico, and do a report for the Canadian government on that. And the cadets that were there with me were just in awe of this ship that had 5,000 sailors on it. And they were accepted as part of the ship's company at the time. So, and what they were doing was they were training young pilots in what we would call Second World War vintage aircraft for low-level flying. So in order to, unbeknownst to us, the United States Navy were getting ready, or the United States government were getting ready to invade Cambodia, you know, the Tet Offensive. And we asked why these sailors were being trained on Second World War vintage planes, propeller job planes. Well, it was for low-level flying, so they could drop some, I would say, materials on the trees and that in Cambodia that would kill them, so they could see who they were going to be invading. So anyway, we knew nothing about that, but the cadets were being told that, look, this is a training exercise. It was no problem. You fellas just enjoy yourselves. And at that time, we did, but we learned a lot because they were actually simulating downed aircraft in the Gulf of Mexico. They were sending out rescue Zodiacs to pick these sailors up, and they were throwing them over the Zodiacs and getting shark repellent put around them so they could fight off sharks in case they had to, and the cadets were witness to all this kind of stuff. So anyway, back in Cornwallis, after we come back from there, I'm a little ahead of myself. I had the opportunity on Friday afternoons, if I think the Premier, maybe, I don't know if there's anybody else in here that's belonged to the Navy and spent some time in the wardroom at Cornwallis, but I certainly did. And on Friday afternoons, the weepers and, no, that's right. But anyway, yeah, I'm sure. But anyway, I was sitting there, and one of the things you become aware of is the world around you. I was sitting in the wardroom having a beer on Friday afternoon, and like every other officer, after the Friday's work was done, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah, and that was late. But anyway, the smoking lamp was lit in those days too. So anyway, I turned on the television, and it was Neil Armstrong was on the television setting foot on the moon. And we were sitting there watching history being made at the same time around the same time the United States were getting ready to invade Cambodia, you know. And so those kinds of issues, and for cadets, you know, all of this stuff is something that you'd never get if you weren't involved with the cadet movement. So moving along after that to some of the other stuff that we were involved in, the integration of the forces didn't mean a heck of a lot to the cadet program, except that we changed uniforms and we got outfitted with these horrible green outfits in the summertime, and the square rig went by the boards, and the navy blue disappeared, and the white ensigns come down, and all that stuff that you cried. I literally cried when they took the white ensign down off the ships in those days, and I'll never forgive Paul Hellyer. I don't know, even though we still live in, but anyway, when they integrated the forces, and now they're getting back to values that each of the other components of the armed forces treasure, and I'm happy about that because there is a great deal of history, and I'm regaling a little bit about it because this is the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Navy this year, you know, and I would hope that one of the things that might come out of this celebration this year, and I expect I'll be talking to the Premier about this because we were talking to some Navy people who were interested in perhaps getting a branch of HMCS Scotia back into Cape Breton because it's a historic thing, and at Point Edward there's lots of room down there, and there's a great Army base down there now that's with all the modern facilities, and they suggested that perhaps the Premier and I should trot on down to see the Admiral one of these days and have a chat with them about perhaps doing a study on the value of putting a training base back down for cadets in Cape Breton Island. And the reason for that is obvious, because the cadet movement, while it was very strong in Cape Breton over the years, all elements, particularly the one I'm most familiar with, the C element, the numbers are going down so drastic that some of the corps are closing. And I think that there has to be a kickstart again to convince people the value of these programs, the value of the responsibility engendered by young men and women now for many years who go through the cadet movement, and how it stands them in later life. And I can tell you that all the cadets that I know that went through the Sydney Sea Cadet Corps, number 2, over the years, have gone on to great careers in both military life and civilian life. Great careers in the RCMP, the police forces, the Canadian forces, the Navy, banking industry, and it all started because of their discipline. Their discipline, Mr. Speaker, when they were in the Cadet Corps that I belong to, and Cadet Corps that some of you probably belong to throughout wherever your home communities were. But I can tell you that to be able to put together a 50-person band to welcome a ship of the line into Sydney Harbor, whether it be, well, in those days it was tribal class destroyers or DDHs, and that it wasn't, the frigates came on a little bit later. But anyway, to watch the Sea Cadet band welcoming a ship of the line into Sydney Harbor was something to behold. And then to do a sunset ceremony for them with our also 50-person guard, you know, and you know, those are the days when we had 200 in the Corps. Now it's sad to say there are perhaps 20 in the Corps in Sydney. And that's stretching it. And some of the other corps are having similar problems. So perhaps a kickstart in Cape Breton, Mr. Premier, someday you and I might find a few minutes to talk to the Admiral about perhaps doing something about that. But that's for another day. The cadet movement, as far as I'm concerned, was something that I cherish. I've been with it. I've never missed an annual inspection of the Sydney Sea Cadet Corps since I was a cadet. And that's over, it would be 54 years I've been attending inspections. Even when I was mayor of Sydney for 15 years, I would never miss inspection. And the one thing I've noticed is that the quality of the Cadet Corps remains the same or is even getting better, but the quantity has gone way down. And while I see the people who are turned out, the young cadets, men and women who are turned out, is excellent, the numbers aren't there, and it's sad to see that we no longer have a band, that we no longer can put together a ceremonial guard, that we no longer can get involved in things that we'd like to get involved in simply because we don't have the numbers. However, I should inform the House and through you, Mr. Speaker, that the programs there are there. The federal government has been very supportive of the cadet program, no matter what federal government it was, and it's still there. The support is still there. The Navy League of Canada, in regards to Sea Cadets, is still there as a sponsor. Sea Cadets who want to can travel every summer and get paid for it and go out and learn things about their country. They can go on American ships, they can go to Europe, they can go to out the West Coast on camps out there, or they can go to what used to be called Stadacona here. They can go to Shearwater, they can go to almost anywhere they want and get paid for it. In addition to that, there's a very generous scholarship program out there for cadets who want to go on to university. If you want to, now you can go as a cadet, and I'm putting a great commercial in here for anybody's parents that are listening out there, or any young men and women who might want to join the cadet. I would appeal to you to give it a try, because the other on scholarships, you can get if you commit yourself to the Canadian Armed Forces for a period of time, and if you already have a profession and you want to get into the armed forces, they will certainly give you a bonus to get in, and will certainly give you the best type of employment you could ever get. If you're starting out as a university student, I would say go Navy. But if not Navy, go Air or go Army. But if you want to go, I covered all the bases, yeah. But I'm an unabashed supporter of the Navy, as you can probably respect by now. But anyway, you can get a college education for nothing. You know, I had the opportunity to go up to Ontario, to Kingston, Royal Military College, back in 1967, centennial year, 67, yeah. And I had some cadets up there for the summer, and we got to know some of the recruits who were going through the officer training school there at the Royal Military College. And I've got to tell you, these were bright young guys in engineering, and mostly in engineering students and electrical students. And they would graduate as lieutenants in the Canadian Navy and would immediately be put to work. And I can tell you that if a research project was done the number of cadets that I know that even went through Royal Military College or St. Jean, Quebec, or out on the West Coast at Royal Roads and those places, you know, like it was Royal Roads, but anyway, all of those colleges prepare you for the future, because you not only learn a trade that you can use in Civvy Street once you leave the forces, you have a trade that you can employ while you're in the forces that will enhance your educational requirements, and you can go back for postgraduate degrees, even up to the doctorate level, if you want, while still remaining a member of the Canadian Forces. So, you know, it astounds me that we're not doing a better job of promoting the cadet programs to our youth out there. Heaven knows we need something for the youth to grab onto, and the discipline and the responsibility that you learn early in life. You know, and when you learn as a cadet, you learn to say a simple thing like sir or ma'am, you know, in the Navy. And I learned that at a young age, and every time I see somebody, I always say yes, sir, or no, sir, somebody I'm meeting, or something like this. Or, you know, you learn how to respect others that are in the cadet movement with you, and you learn to respect authority. And you do that at an early age, and it never leaves you. I can tell you, it never leaves you. The esprit de corps that you get, for whether you're in the Navy or whether you're in the Army or the Air Cadets, or the younger than the Sea Cadets, and I congratulate the Premier again for mentioning the Navy League Cadets in his motion, because that they too are a very important part, because they're a preliminary to getting in the Sea Cadets. We didn't have that in my day, but I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I guess if I would ask one thing, and the Premier certainly has introduced the bill to the House for discussion, and if I could suggest one thing to all our members, that we take the time to take a look at the value of the cadet program and to encourage young constituents in each and every one of your constituencies to give the cadet movement a try. Now, it's not for everybody, because there is a word there that's employed very often, and one that we have to have in the cadet movement if you're going on into the Canadian Forces is discipline. And everybody is not acceptable to having a large degree of discipline. But I can tell you, and the Premier would tell you this, that when you go through new entry training school, it's pretty rugged, you know, for 6 or 7 weeks. But after that, it's not too bad. You know, it's not, you don't go through the rest of your life getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and running 10 blocks or 10 miles or something before you get your breakfast. You know, that's during new entry training and perhaps in your courses. But after that, it's a pretty good life. And I have to tell you that some of the people that I've encouraged to go on into the forces, and most of them went Navy, because I encouraged them to try that first. And I can tell you that having been to sea a few times myself, it was quite an adventure. And the young people that I know that are serving on Canadian ships today are enjoying that as well. You know, and I enjoyed it when I was on there, but there is a lot of discipline. But if you're looking at your future and you're looking at establishing yourself in business or the professions, there's no better grounding, Mr. Speaker, than to come out of the Cadet Corps movement and enter the Canadian Forces at the entry level. And then, of course, like everybody, they aspire to become first a leading seaman, then a petty officer, and then chief petty officer, and then finally a commissioned officer. But the chief petty officer will tell you that the chief petty officer is it. They don't worry about the commissioned officers. But I mean, there is if you want to enjoy a career, a rewarding career in your life, no better place to do it than Canadian Forces. And I got to tell you, and I'm going to wind up in a minute, Mr. Speaker, but I'm going to tell you that if you look at the benefit package of the people in the Canadian Forces, if you look at the pay schedule, for example, if you look at the facilities that you live in, if you look at all of the amenities that are there for federal government employees in the forces, there's no better life. There's no life like it. And that's another saying of the old Navy, you know, go Navy, no life like it. Learn to serve, you know, and I think that we've come a long way from the days that when you were in sight of the drill shed at Cornwallis, that you had to double everywhere. You could never walk within sight of the drill shed down there, and things have changed now considerably down there. But the cadet program, for those of you who may not know, the Sea Cadet program is still alive and well at Cornwallis in the summertime. And I was down there for the 50th anniversary of HMCS Acadia a couple of years ago and had the pleasure of taking the salute one morning at the graduation ceremonies of the cadets. And I got down off the dais and I went out and I marched with them because I felt it one more time, you know, and it never leaves you. Mr. Speaker, I would encourage everybody in this House to talk to young people about joining the cadets. Thank you very much.
The honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to stand here today and talk about Bill 23, an act to establish a day to recognize the Royal Canadian Sea, Army and Air Cadets and the Navy League Cadets in Nova Scotia. And I too want to congratulate the Premier for bringing this forward. I think it's a very astute move on his part, and I think this being the 100th-year anniversary of the Navy, I think it really serves well for the young people of the community. And I want to congratulate the member from Cape Breton South on what he had to say and his little history lesson for us all, because not all of us have had the opportunity to be members of the cadets. I happen to be a member of the Army cadets for a period of time, but they didn't last too long. But I couldn't help but think when the member for Cape Breton South was mentioning his beginnings with the Sea Cadets that I was only a twinkle in my father's eye at that time, and it was. That was a long time. But what that really serves to say is the lessons that are instilled in the Sea Cadets stay with people for a long time, and I think that's something that we need to remember. And the Premier mentioned about having the longest-serving Sea Cadet organization here in Nova Scotia, and that would be in Windsor, and that would be Squadron number 106. And again, the history and the fact that we could have something that would last that long is a very, very proud thing that we as Nova Scotians can talk about. I'm sure the Minister of Economic Development is saying he's very familiar, and I'm sure he is, because I know the role that his father played in many different areas down there and with the Legion. So I think that what we are talking about here today is it seems to be a part of what is the way of life in Nova Scotia. And we talk about something that is fitting, you know, when you talk about going and joining the Sea Cadets, there's a whole lot of education that you get there that you couldn't get anywhere else. You learn valuable skills, life skills. You learn to work together. You learn to have respect. And you learn about structure. And these are all the types of things that we as a society really need so that we can grow and expand. And when we hear of all these things in school these days, when we hear about bullying and all those situations, we think about the kind of structure that can be given to someone when they join a cadet movement. And I think it's something that is valuable for us. And of course, here in Nova Scotia, a calling to serve in any type of military is a calling that I believe is a very strong, a very noble, and probably there is no stronger calling than that of military service. And the number of Nova Scotians that have taken on that task, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that the economy of Nova Scotia is surrounded and has been impacted on what is taking place with the military in Nova Scotia. And the Sea Cadets and the Air Cadets and all the cadet movement is sort of the beginning of all that in my mind. Now, in my own constituency, I have two groups of Sea Cadets, one in Marion Bridge and one in Donkin. And as the member for Cape Breton South mentioned, these groups are shrinking. But the children and the cadets that are involved in them, they're very dedicated. And the other people that are so dedicated are the leaders of the movement of the Sea Cadets. You know, it's one thing to have an organization, but if you don't have leadership, if you don't have strong leadership, then that organization will die. We have very strong leadership in both those corps, and we have the programs that were mentioned that are available through the Defense Department to help keep these organizations alive. So it's very important. And there's so many opportunities opened up to some of these young children that are involved in the cadet movement. Opportunities like there can be summer jobs. You can be off and learn how to work with others on a ship. You can see different parts of the world that you may never have an opportunity to see if you were just waiting and didn't have your involvement in the cadet movement. There's all kinds of opportunities opened up to these young people, and it gives them a different view of the world. And a lot of times, Mr. Speaker, I think it gives them a lot more thanks for what we have here in Nova Scotia and where we live. So it's a great education, and it's an education that you can get by just being a hard worker and being dedicated and being respectful. And that's something that I think is very, very important. You know, and the big thing, of course, is sportsmanship. They learn to be involved. They learn to be part of different challenges that are going on as a cadet movement. And all of this just builds character and makes better Nova Scotians, and we're very lucky to have that. Now, one of the things that I think that we have to think about, and I've seen a couple and I've heard many speak about it, and the member for Cape Breton South mentioned it too, and that, of course, was the sunset ceremonies and what takes place there. And it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the cadets to show off their skills and what they've learned. It's an opportunity to show their parents and their grandparents and their family. But it's also an opportunity to show members of the community what they have learned as cadets. So with all these things, it builds the character. And anything that we can do to build the character of our young people in this province, I think makes tremendous amount of sense. So I know that our caucus is very supportive of supporting this bill, and look forward to seeing the first Saturday of November being recognized for the cadets in the province of Nova Scotia. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to rise, say a few words today on Bill 23. First of all, to thank the Premier for bringing this bill forward. And I won't be too lengthy because my colleague, member from Cape Breton South, took us down a nostalgic and a strong memory lane in terms of cadets, and that's where I need to start with this bill, and that is the part that cadets played in my life and in character formation. When I went to high school in grade 9 in central Newfoundland, an all-boys school, 350 in the school, 300 were in cadets. We had a battalion of Army cadets. And I think the part that made a wonderful connection for all of us was that our instructors were true veterans of the Second World War. And that played a really dominant part in our training and how we looked upon cadets, the military, and the place that it played in our lives at that time, and for many who came out of those battalions and Army Cadet and Navy and Air Force Corps went on to military careers, many of my classmates in fact. So I see great value in the cadet program, in the cadet movement, and the number of skills and the number of opportunities in either branch that expands your horizons when you're an adolescent. I think, for example, in my area of the several thousand cadets that come to summer camp in Greenwood at 14 Wing Greenwood, and the opportunity to experience flight and to go up in a glider and have those kinds of experiences are so truly valuable. In my area, as I mentioned, is the Greenwood Graham Squadron, and they still have over 100 cadets in their corps. And every Wednesday night I have training. I've gotten out to a few of their training nights because, again, as several members have said, it's a little bit of our past. And we like to connect with things that were part of our own upbringing. In our area, we have an outstanding instructor in Major Johnson, and he has contributed immensely to the growth of the Corps in Greenwood, and he's been so recognized actually that he's going to take on an expanded role through southwestern Nova Scotia to actually work on all branches of cadets, and that is the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, to hopefully invigorate some of the corps that have lost tremendous number of members and that may possibly fold. He's going to work on the recruitment and, in fact, reformation of some of the corps that have gone through some difficult times. I don't think it's any accident that a private school like King's Edgehill has a cadet corps. They realize the kind of elements that the training brings to the formation of their students, and so I think that association with school is in fact, again, a very, very strong connection and can help reach some of the goals of your overall programs. One of the things and one of the reasons that I really promote cadets is not only my own life experience, but I know as a teacher at West Kings, where there's always been a very strong program in Greenwood, that again, it's something that I noticed, some of the intangibles that students were picking up from the discipline, from the training, from the program, from the demands, and even getting them into a good schedule, which again, cadets requires, because for some, it can actually be 2 outings a week. So I'm pleased to see that the Premier has brought this bill forward, and that we will, in the first Saturday of November, as MLAs perhaps have an opportunity to go out and recognize a cadet group in our area. Since becoming an MLA, I have not missed one of the inspections of the Graham flight in Greenwood, and I have a great honor this year, and especially now with this bill, I'm sure will be passed, and I'll be able to mention it this year at the inspection. And I have a great honor this year in that I've actually been asked to be the reviewing officer for the Graham Squadron. So I will acknowledge the Premier on that occasion for bringing this bill forward. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I take my place.
Thank you. If I recognize the Honourable the Premier, will be to close debate on Bill number 23. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to say that I really appreciate the comments that were made by all the members, most particularly, though, the member for Cape Breton South. I thought it was instructive and reflective, and I think laid out some of the history. That it's wonderful to know these kinds of things, because if we forget our history, then we are forgetting part of the fabric of our communities and of our province. So it was great to hear what he had to say. I didn't get a chance to reminisce, or didn't take the chance to reminisce quite as much as he did, but since I am standing to close debate on this bill, I would like to just note one thing. It doesn't really so much has to do with my time in cadets so much as my time in cadets led to my enrollment in the armed forces in many ways, and of course into the Navy. And that is that I received by way of email, in fact, just about 2 hours ago, that my course training officer, as I went through the Naval Officer Training Center in Esquimalt, is actually retiring this year, or as we say, swallowing the anchor. And Lieutenant Commander Chris Bowie, he's had a long and distinguished career in the Navy. He was both a leader and a mentor to many people who went through the Naval Officer Training Center. So it's just, I think, a great opportunity for me just to formally recognize the work that he's done and the profound effect that he's had on many people's lives, many of whom today are flag officers, they are senior ranking members of the Canadian forces. They are leaders in business, and yes, some of them even leaders in politics, Mr. Speaker. He said, and I put in a little note to him, he said that, because I remember him saying this when we went through, he said, you know, the Navy doesn't mind getting a half-wit because we give them the other half. But, of course, I left the Navy early, so I went, of course, into a profession where being a half-wit is not a liability. But with a little naval training, you can still have some success. So I just want to take the opportunity to really salute a guy who I think in his time in the Navy has done a great many good things for a great many people. And certainly I would, as the member for Cape Breton South said, I certainly would have no problem going with him and talking to the Admiral about the reinstitution of a cadet program in Cape Breton. Unfortunately, we're going to be losing Admiral Paul Madison later on this year as he goes off to I won't say more important, but equally important duties in Ottawa, and there's a new there'll be a new change of command, or there'll be a change of command, and we'll be welcoming a new Admiral here. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to close debate on Bill 23, the Sea, Army, Air, and Navy League Cadets Day Act. Thank you. Did I say second?
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 23, Sea, Army, Air, and Navy League Cadet Day Act. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 23, entitled An Act to Establish a Day to Recognize the Royal Canadian Sea, Army, and Air Cadets and the Navy League Cadets in Nova Scotia.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 36, the Engineering Professions Act?
A public bill for second reading, Bill number 36, Engineering Profession Act. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move the second reading of the Engineering Professions Act be moved.
Question has been called. The House ready for the question? Question. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 36, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 148 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Engineering Profession Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I call another bill, I wonder if it's possible with the consent of the House to revert to the order.
There's been a request to revert to the order. Is it agreed? It is agreed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Presenting reports of committees.
Presenting reports of committees. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, as Chair of the Committee on Law Amendments, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bill. An act to amend Chapter 450 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Summary Proceedings Act. Yeah.
Thank you. The report is tabled. The
Mr. Speaker, the committee recommends that the bill to a favourable consideration of the House without amendment.
Thank you. The report is tabled. Order that these bills be referred to the Committee on Whole House on Bills. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please now call Bill 13, the Motor Vehicle Act?
Bill number 13, the Motor Vehicle Act. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you. I am pleased to rise before the House to speak about proposed changes to the Motor Vehicle Act. The amendment to Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes of the Motor Vehicle Act is being brought forward today, Mr. Speaker, to enable participants of Nova Scotia's Alcohol Ignition Interlock Program to continue in the program even if they move to another province in Canada. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, this amendment will enable alcohol ignition interlock participants from other provinces to continue under the program when they move to Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the Alcohol Ignition Interlock Program has proven to be an effective way to help reduce drinking and driving in other parts of Canada and the world. Nova Scotia implemented its Alcohol Ignition Interlock Program in October 2008. The program requires those convicted of alcohol-related driving offences to install a small, handheld breath testing device to their vehicle's ignition. The device requires the driver to provide breath samples at random times while the engine is running. In addition, the program also requires participants to undergo a mandatory education and alcohol assessment program through Addiction Services. And I must take away from the notes just for a second to say that we need to be very proud of this legislation that was passed, that we do provide the service along with the measures of the program. Under the current legislation, Mr. Speaker, participants of Nova Scotia's Ignition Interlock program must return to the province in order to complete their program and reinstate their driver's license. Those from other provinces who move to Nova Scotia must likewise return to their own jurisdiction to complete the programs before they can be granted a license in our province. As people move from one province to another for work or for other reasons, it has become necessary for us to develop a way to keep participants under the Alcohol Ignition Interlock program until they have established that they no longer drive while impaired. This amendment is a proactive way of addressing one of the reasons why people are not able to complete their interlock program. Mr. Speaker, this proposed amendment will help the government and enforcement authorities in Nova Scotia, as well as other provinces, monitor and reform impaired driving behaviour anywhere in this country. If approved, Mr. Speaker, this amendment will allow us to start discussions to enter into agreements with other provinces to put this change in place for our interlock program. This will be a positive step towards our fight against drinking and driving in Nova Scotia and everywhere in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Before I recognize the next speaker, I will recognize the Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In your gallery this afternoon, we have a distinguished visitor. Well, at least a distinguished visitor in the summertime when he acknowledges that I move there once in a while at Brackley Beach. But in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce you to the Honourable Richard E. Brown, the Minister of Environment, Energy and Forestry. Mr. Brown, could you stand and receive the recognition of the House?
Thank you. A warm welcome to all our visitors in the gallery this afternoon. The chair now recognizes the honourable member from Cape Breton South.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of Bill 13 on behalf of our party, and I was listening to the minister in her opening remarks there, talking about the interlock program and the fact that that's now going to be mobile and that somebody could actually work away and not have to come back to Nova Scotia for testing or periodic examination of that. And that brings to mind just recently, a gentleman who was under this program was working out in Alberta, as a lot of Cape Bretoners are working out in Alberta, and had to come back to Nova Scotia to do another test and everything. And it was quite onerous for him because he not only did he have the problem with the testing itself, he couldn't get it done out in Alberta. But anyway, that's going to change, and they'll be able to continue the program even if they move to other jurisdictions. So similarly, new residents who must participate in the interlock program will be able to complete the program in Nova Scotia. That's another plus, because there are time to time there are people that move to Nova Scotia for various reasons, and they should be able to get the same privileges that somebody from Nova Scotia away would get. And Mr. Speaker, the interlock program is for people who have lost their driver's license because of alcohol-related conviction or have an alcohol-related offense on their driving record. Participants now in Nova Scotia interlock program move to another province, again, must return to complete the program, and this will change that. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's legislation that's moving in the right direction. It's not it's not keeping the punitive nature of the offense itself to the fore. In other words, it's giving these people the opportunity to take advantage of the programs that are available by legislation in Nova Scotia and also in other jurisdictions across Canada. And there's several difficulties with the actual interlock program once installed in the vehicles. And you know, we've heard reports about faulty systems, including issues surrounding the warnings going off without real cause for them to do that. And in one instance, we read about a participant turned their windshield wiper on and set off the interlock program. So, but I believe all of these things are being fine-tuned, and that's a good thing. And each time that happens, the participant must have their system recalibrated at their own expense. So that, to me, is something that should be, I believe they did at one time, you know, but the problem, I guess, if we're moving to change that, that's a good thing. The minister suggests that is the case. And if it happens on a regular basis, it can be costly. And that's why I think that there are, if there are some latitude for that, it would be good. And the participants should be assured by government that the system works properly all the time, and I believe that the legislation calls for that. So we support the legislation, Mr. Speaker, and again, the person that I talk to will be very happy to hear that if he still has to come back every once in a while to Nova Scotia to have his system looked at or his penalty advanced, then he can do it out in Alberta and likewise. So I believe it's a good bill, and our party will be supporting the bill, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. The honourable member from Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Bill 13 is a good bill, and I commend the minister for introducing it in the House. This is a good bill because it protects drivers, not only on our provincial roads, but on roads across our country. It is important for provinces in Canada to communicate with each other, to ensure safe passage on all of our highways, and this bill accomplishes that. This ignition interlock system gives people convicted of drinking and driving a second chance. People make mistakes. Sadly, in some cases, these mistakes have caused injury and death to innocent people. This bill helps to protect the integrity of the offer to give drivers convicted of drinking and driving a second chance. It enhances accountability. It creates a system to better track compliance to ensure that drivers respect the second chance they've been given. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, the Progressive Conservative members believe that Bill 13 is worthy of our support. We will be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you. If I recognize the Honourable Minister will be to close the debate. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you very much, and I ask now to call the question.
The Honourable Minister.
I ask to close debate on. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion before the House is for a second reading on Bill number 13. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried.
13, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Or that this bill be referred to law amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call Bill 18, the Vital Statistics Act?
Bill number 18, Vital Statistics Act, for second reading. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise before the House to speak about proposed amendments to the Vital Statistics Act. In the last 20 to 30 years, the role of the Deputy Registrar General of the Vital Statistics Office has changed significantly. Apart from managing an effective registration system, the position now entails increased interaction with other government agencies and a heightened focus on requirements for security processes and proper validations of data. Mr. Speaker, in 2008, the position of Assistant Deputy Registrar General was created to provide an additional management support to the Deputy Registrar General and the Vital Statistics Program. This proposed amendment, Mr. Speaker, will give the Deputy Registrar General the flexibility to effectively delegate some of his or her duties to the Deputy Registrar General whenever appropriate. With the ability of senior officers to share tasks effectively, the Vital Statistics Office will be in the best position to continue to meet the growing demand for its services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Are there the Honourable the member from Cape Breton South?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the member for Dartmouth North, we will be supporting this bill.
Dartmouth East.
Or East.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you. The honourable member from Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And should this bill improve the operations of the Deputy Registrar General for the benefit of Nova Scotians, we are also pleased to support this bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I recognize the Honourable the Minister will be to close debate on Bill number 18. The Honourable the Minister, Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, and I call to close debate.
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 18, Vital Statistics Act. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye? Against? Motion carried.
Bill 18, title and act amend Chapter 494, the revised statutes 1989, the Vital Statistics Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, before I introduce the next bill, I'm wondering if I can get concurrence in the House that we're approaching the hour of interruption, but I've got two more bills to call and we'll close the government's business for the day. And if we say that 6:15 will be the hour of interruption, would the House agree to that?
Does it agree? It is agreed. Thank you. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the House for their concurrence. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill 29, the Municipal Government Act?
Thank you. Bill number 29, the Municipal Governments Act. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin, I was negligent in thanking the honourable members opposite for their remarks. So I apologize for that. It's the learning of all the language too. Sometimes takes a while. So thank you. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to speak to Bill 29, Amendments to the Municipal Government Act. Mr. Speaker, these amendments will allow the province to establish a debt collection program on behalf of municipalities. Part of our mandate as a department is to assist municipalities, which in turn helps keep communities strong throughout the province. Small debts owed to municipalities can be a challenge for them to collect. Bills owed for utility services, facility rentals, or bylaw infractions can add up to a significant amount owing to individual municipal units. Mr. Speaker, currently, municipalities are owed an estimated $8 million in debt. Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations operates an effective debt collection unit. Our highly trained staff provides compassionate and effective debt collection service. The UNSM approached our department to see if municipalities could tap into these services to help them collect more of the debts owed to them. Mr. Speaker, our government is happy to move forward with their request. First, the province needs to amend the Municipal Government Act to provide the legal authority to collect debts owed to municipalities. Mr. Speaker, once it has been implemented, this program will give municipalities further access to the provincial government's expertise. Hopefully, this will help them collect more funds that will, in turn, go back to their communities. This is one measure that will help sustain vibrant communities in every region of the province. With these few words, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading for Bill 29.
Thank you. Are there any speakers? Question has been called. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 29. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye? Aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 29, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to call Bill number 33, the Securities Transfer Act.
Thank you. Public bill for second reading, Bill number 33, Securities Transfer Act. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to say a few words about Bill 33, the Securities Transfer Act. This new legislation governs non-trading aspects of securities. Its purpose is not to change the manner in which securities are issued, held, or transferred, but rather to declare the relationships among the parties involved. This Act brings greater legal certainty around the holding, transferring, and pledging of securities. Mr. Speaker, under this new legislation, securities transferred electronically will now have the same legal certainty as those on paper certificates. This reflects current business practices. This legislation also addresses the ability of holders to use their securities as collateral. The Securities Transfer Act is the result of a collaboration with the Nova Scotia Barristers Society and the Uniform Law Conference of Canada. The aim of this effort is to develop modern and harmonized commercial laws across Canada. Mr. Speaker, uniform commercial laws help Nova Scotia to remain competitive in the national and international marketplace. It aligns us with what is becoming a global standard for commercial laws. I would like to acknowledge the efforts of the Nova Scotia Barristers Society and thank them for their partnership on this project. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to move second reading of the Securities Transfer Act.
Thank you. Are there any speakers? The honourable member from